Well, hello, everyone. Good to see you this morning. Thank you for that lovely introduction, Chris. I think I should stop right now, actually. And I also want to thank the leadership for inviting me today. It's really an honor to be able to address you. As some of you might know, I've been interested in this issue of trying to apply the science of learning to education for quite a while. Gosh, sounds like a long time. And I guess the question that's really motivated me is how can we help people learn in ways so that they can take what they've learned and apply it to new situations? And that's really the classic issue of transfer, which has been at the heart of both education and psychology for more than 100 years. So I'll solve that problem for you today, this morning. It's a joke. But this question is kind of what motivated me to get interested in this issue of multimedia learning, and in particular, how we can use words and graphics together to help people understand, especially scientific, mathematical, and technical material. So for the last several decades, my colleagues and I at University of California, Santa Barbara have been trying to explore how to design effective multimedia presentations, basically e-learning presentations that would help people do well on transfer tests. So I want to share some of that with you today. So I know that when we sit down to try and design instructional methods, a lot of the time we base things on good intentions or expert opinion, fads, ideology, testimonials, common practice. But for a long time, I think those of us who do in this field who take a science approach to this try to convince folks that we should be taking a more scientific approach. So that's what I want to try and do this morning. To look at how we can design instructional methods that are evidence-based and grounded in theory and have learning outcomes as their focus. So these are a lot of the collaborators I've worked with and have done all the work, so I'll just skip right over them and get to the point. So I want to just first look very briefly at what I mean by the science of learning, assessment, and instruction, and then focus on principles for multimedia instruction. So I usually like to get a little audience participation, but given the time limit, I'll be the audience for you here. So I want you to kind of look at this slide and imagine what's wrong with this. Or maybe, does anybody want to suggest something that's wrong with this? It's early in the morning, I know. Any problems with it? Yeah. Yeah, we've got a random surfer dude there. I mean, it says surfing through the bloodstream, but really the graphic has nothing to, that photo has nothing to do with the graphic, which unfortunately is not an uncommon feature. I'm using these slides. My students have gathered hundreds of slides from the internet that violate my principles of multimedia design. This is one of my favorites. This violates what I call the Coherence Principle, which is don't put extraneous material in this case in the slide. Here's another one. This one is from a website intended for kids to try to explain the human digestive system. One problem with this is that it's very hard to figure out what the numbers correspond to. You have to look back and forth. If you look at 4, you have to look over to the liver and read that. That violates what I would call the spatial contiguity principle, that the printed word should be placed next to the part of the graphic they're talking about. This causes people to have to look back and forth a lot. Here's another slide. Anybody know what this one is about? What is it? See if there's any biologists here.
Yes, the Krebs cycle.
Okay. This one, the problem from an instructional point of view is that it's just overwhelming and it gives you no signals as to where to look or what to do with it. So it needs to be simplified, broken down into parts, which I call segmenting, and it also needs some signaling to show you where you should look at this if you're not an expert. Here's one that kind of has the opposite problem. It doesn't have enough complexity. It's just what I would call representational illustration. So let me look briefly just at the science of learning, instruction, and assessment, just to touch on these. Every cognitive scientist has to have a flow chart, and this is my flow chart. So the idea here is that information comes in from the outside world, and for some reason, it always comes in from the left side. I don't know why. Here we have words and pictures that come. The pictures come in through our eyes. The words, if they're spoken, through our ears. If they're printed, through our eyes. If we pay attention to this fleeting image that's coming in, which I call selecting words and selecting images, then some of the sounds and images make it into our working memory. And working memory, we can organize the images into what I call a pictorial model. We can organize the incoming verbal material into a verbal model. So those are the arrows that say organizing words and images. And then we activate relevant prior knowledge from long-term memory and use it to help integrate the words and pictures with each other and with the incoming information. So I call that integrating. Did that make sense at all in 2 minutes? Okay. So that's how learning works in 30 seconds. So I might have left something out. So the three main processes from an instructional point of view that I think we need to be concerned with is guiding learners, selecting of relevant information, helping guide learners, how learners organize that information, and helping learners activate relevant prior knowledge and integrate that with their existing incoming knowledge. Let's see, in terms of the science of instruction, there are really three issues that I want to kind of focus on. We want instruction that helps us deal with these three kinds of processing. Extraneous processing is cognitive processing that doesn't support the instructional objective, and it's caused by just poor design. That's the kind we don't like, so a good instructional goal is to reduce extraneous processing. Essential processing is cognitive processing required to mentally represent the incoming information. This is caused just by the complexity of the material. When we have material that's very complex for the learner, we have to help them manage their essential processing. And lastly, generative processing. This is the deeper kind of cognitive processing where you try to make sense out of the material. This is caused by the learner's motivation to make an effort to learn. And so an instructional goal is to foster generative processing. So the three goals I really want to focus in on in this talk are techniques that help reduce extraneous processing, manage essential processing, or foster generative processing. Does that make sense? Kind of okay. You're a very nice audience. Everybody says yes. I like that. So in terms of assessment, the studies I want to talk about all kind of have a very similar feel to them. Here, what I'm trying to do is take an evidence-based approach where we take an instructional message, the kind of a base version of it, add one design feature to it that based on theory should make learning better, and then just compare the learning outcomes, usually a transfer test, to see whether adding that new feature improved transfer performance. And the metric that I like to focus on is effect size, because that's gives you a common metric for comparing across studies. And in general, we want an effect size that's at least 0.4, because there's consensus that that is educationally important. So that the treatment causes at least 0.4 standard deviations improvement. Just to give you an example, this is a very brief multimedia lesson on pumps. I like it because this is the first one I ever did, and I drew these pictures myself using a program probably no one ever heard of called McDraw. It was on the original Macs, the little ones, the little. So here is an animation version of this where we have the handle go up and down, and a voice says, when the handle is pulled up, the piston moves up, the inlet valve opens, and so on. I thought this would be good for UC Santa Barbara because we have 20,000 students and we have 20,000 bicycles. So everyone rides their bike, but nobody really cared about pumps. A typical retention test would be to ask people, after they've seen that wonderful animation, to write down all they can remember. Or a transfer test could be a redesign question. How could you make it more reliable or more effective? A troubleshooting question like, suppose you pull up and push down on the handle, but no air comes out. What could be wrong? And a conceptual question about, well, why does air enter or leave? Where you're supposed to invent the idea of difference in air pressure, which is never discussed. This is a lesson on lightning formation. And this is more of a narrated animation on it. And we can have the same kind of transfer questions here. What could you do to reduce the intensity of lightning, or suppose there are clouds but no lightning? So these are all attempts to gauge not only retention but also transfer, because I'm mostly interested in promoting transfer, being able to take what you learn from a lesson and apply it. Here's a lesson on brakes, which actually I knew nothing about before I started this. Now my whole lab used to have just all these different posters about brakes that my students collected from every place just to make fun of me. They're good at that. But anyway, and some of the questions we can ask are quite similar. Suppose you step on the brakes and the car doesn't stop. What could be wrong? My favorite answer to that one is, your neighbor cut your brake line. You do not get credit for that, though. Okay, so that gives you a little background. I want to spend a little time now just looking at the principles that I'd like us to think about. So what really got me started in this field is the realization that if you add graphics to text, that can help people learn better, because the most common way of trying to explain things to people is to use words, either orally, giving a lecture like this, or in print, or both print in a book or print in on a screen. And the question is there any value added to adding graphics? What exactly does that do? So here's my rationale for adding graphics to words. This is the passage really that got me started. It's from the World Book Encyclopedia, actually when it was a print encyclopedia. And this is the section explaining how a bicycle tire pump works. And the part that's italicized is really the only part that explains it. The rest is just really irrelevant. And if you ask somebody to read that and then you ask them to explain how a bicycle tire pump works and you ask them those transfer questions, they can remember about 25% of the concept, the idea units, and they can't answer any of the transfer questions. So my conclusion was people don't learn a whole lot from the words. They can remember some of them, but they really don't know what they mean. But if we add illustrations, just take the same words that were in there and embed them within an illustration that shows a picture of the pump before and after you push down the handle, that greatly improves performance. Another version of this is to just take a narration about how the pump works, let people listen to it, test them on it. They don't do very well on transfer, and they just remember, like I said, about 25% of the words. But if we add an animation of the pump to that exact same soundtrack, people do much, much better on the transfer task. So this is data from 9 of the studies that we conducted. The black bars are when you have words and pictures. The white bars are just words alone. And the dependent measure here is performance on a transfer test. How many creative solutions did people come up with? You can see, in general, people are coming up with 50 to 100% more creative solutions if you add graphics to the words. So this is what kind of got me started thinking about the idea that there might be something useful about multimedia as a way of helping people understand, especially explaining how things work, scientific ideas, mathematical ideas, anything that has kind of a conceptual base to it. Does that make sense? Okay. Unfortunately, not all graphics are equally helpful, and not all ways of presenting words and pictures together really enhance learning. So the next part of this journey is to figure out, well, how should you actually integrate words and pictures to help people understand better? So from a theoretical point of view, one thing we want when we are creating multimedia messages is to reduce extraneous processing. We want to minimize the amount of wasted cognitive processing because working memory is limited. We only can process a few items in working memory at any one time in each channel. So we want to minimize the extraneous processing so people can engage in productive processing. So these are 5 techniques that I want to look at that are all intended to reduce extraneous processing. So first, let's look at Coherence Principle. So here's an example of a lesson on how a virus causes a cold. You can see we're not in this for the art. We're not really good at this, but it really consists of 5 slides. You watch them on a laptop. This is step 5 in the process. And what we did for some subjects, we just have our regular text. For others, we add an interesting piece of information. So the last 2 sentences in this case are the interesting information that we added about a study conducted in Pennsylvania that reveals people who make love once or twice a week are more immune to colds than folks who abstain. We did a pre-study. We had like a list of 100 what we thought were interesting facts and had UCSB students rate them. That was the #1 most interesting fact. And one thing I found that was really interesting was the ones that were interesting either had to do with sex, death, or filth. Those are the things that were really interesting. All the little scientific things with numbers they didn't care about. But anyway, so that's sometimes called a seductive detail. It's an interesting but irrelevant piece of information. It really has nothing to do with the steps involved in how a virus invades a host cell and takes over. What we found is that adding that seductive detail made people like the lesson more, but learn less. So we also have a little sign in my lab that says, liking is not learning. Because here's something that helps people, they enjoy it more, they think it's more interesting, but they actually learn less when we add those seductive details. In fact, in 23 out of 23 studies that involve adding interesting extraneous material, people do better without that extraneous material with an effect size of greater than 0.8, which is a large effect. And if you don't believe me, here are some of the studies, but I'll just go through them really fast so you can't really look at them. No, I'm only kidding. I'm glad to send these to anyone. So the median effect size here is 0.86. So one very basic idea, which is not really original, is that if you want to help people learn better, keep it simple, don't put in extraneous material, take out anything that really doesn't contribute to the instructional goal. A second principle I want to look at is signaling. How am I doing? Oh, good. Signaling involves highlighting the important information. You can either do that in the text with the words or with the graphics. So this material is coming from a narrated animation about how airplanes achieve lift, which I think about every time a plane takes off. It's all got to do with the shape of a wing, which just seems like a very flimsy thing to keep you in the air. What we do is stress with our voice the key information. So the narrator would say, wing shape, curved upper surface is longer. And the surface on top of the wing is longer than on the bottom. So that's the form of signaling I'm talking about here, just kind of emphasizing the key words, the key concepts by just stress and voice. Doing something like that, just as simple as that, doesn't add any more words, but it just kind of shows you which words to focus on, helps people learn better. So people learn better or more deeply when cues are added that highlight the main ideas and organization of the material. In 24 out of 28 experimental tests, we have a median effect size of 0.4, which is an acceptable effect size. So this is in studies involving all different kinds of materials, yielding a median here of 0.41. So now we have two techniques. Try to keep things simple, but if we can't do that, at least highlight the important material that's in the text so people will focus on that. The third principle for reducing extraneous processing is the redundancy principle. Here, the idea is that which would be better, presenting narration and animation? So here's a little lesson on how lightning storms develop, and you can see at the bottom the voice is saying, as the air in this updraft cools, water vapor condenses into water droplets and forms a cloud. You might think it would be a good idea to add also on-screen text. So the frame on the right shows as the air in the updraft cools, water vapor condenses into water droplets and forms a cloud is now printed on the screen as well as spoken by the narrator. You might think that's better because people could, if you're more of a reader, you could read it. If you're more of a listener, you could listen. It gives you a better chance to use your own personal learning strategy. But what we find in our research is that adding that redundant on-screen text depresses understanding of the lesson. So in 16 out of 16 experimental tests that have been done, people learn more deeply from animation and narration than from animation, narration, and on-screen text with a large median effect size of 0.8 again. So the idea is that when you have to look at the text on the screen, you can't be looking at the animation. And when you're looking at the animation, you can't be looking at the text. So that you're kind of splitting your visual attention there. Also, when you're listening and reading at the same time, you might be trying to reconcile those two verbal streams, which is really creating extraneous processing. That's not really helping you learn. So does that make sense why redundancy might not be good? Is that okay? So this gives you some of the studies and with a median effect size of 0.86. Let me look at another way of trying to reduce extraneous processing. This is the spatial contiguity principle. So consider a slide here that's explaining how a braking system works. It shows the braking system before you step on the brake pedal, and the bottom one shows you after you step on the brake pedal, and then the caption at the bottom explains what's going on. This is kind of a common way of presenting information in a figure. I call it separated presentation because the words are separated from the graphics they're talking about. And the problem with a separated presentation is you have to scan back and forth. You have read some words, then you have to figure out where in the graphic that's referring to. Then you maybe read some words and try to figure out where in the graphic that's referring to. That requires a lot of scanning. That's really wasted processing. You might be spending all the time looking for what the words are talking about and not really thinking about what it means. This is a more integrated presentation that has exactly the same words, exactly the same graphics, but now we're cueing people about where to look. So when the driver steps on the car's brake pedal, it's pointing to that action. And then a piston moves forward inside the master cylinder, we're pointing to where that is. So this I call spatial contiguity because we're putting the words next to or contiguous with the part of the graphic they're talking about. We can have the same thing with an animation. This is, again, one on lightning formation. We can have the words at the bottom of the screen as a caption or next to the thing they're talking about, in this case, the updraft. In 22 out of 22 tests that have been done, we get a very strong effect size, greater than 1, where people learn more deeply when printed words are put next to the part of the graphic they're referring to rather than far away. Is that making sense? Let's see, how are we doing here? Okay. I love this principle because there's no difference between the groups in terms of the graphics or the words. It's just where you put the words. So you can see in all these studies, the median is 1.1. And the last set of techniques for reducing extraneous processing is what I call temporal contiguity. So we can have a narration and graphics of some sort and present them one after the other. So that's a successive presentation. So maybe first you listen to a description of how lightning storms develop. That takes about 2 minutes. Then you watch an animation of how lightning storms develop. That takes about 2 minutes. You might think that's a good way to present it because you're getting kind of 2 exposures to the material. In simultaneous presentation, the narration and the animation are presented at the same time. So as you're listening to it talk about an event, you're also seeing that event in the animation. So that's simultaneous. In 9 out of 9 studies that have been done comparing successive and simultaneous presentation, people always do better with simultaneous. People learn more deeply when corresponding graphics and narration are presented at the same time, with a very large effect size here. So you can see some of the different kinds of materials that were used in these studies. So overall, in terms of reducing extraneous processing, these were really some of the first principles of multimedia design that folks in this field investigated. We have some pretty good evidence for coherence, signaling, redundancy, spatial contiguity, and temporal contiguity. But this is just one part of how we can design effective multimedia presentations. This is a way of getting rid of extraneous processing so learners can use their limited processing capacity for representing the material and trying to make sense out of it. But consider a situation where we have eliminated most of the extraneous processing, but the material itself is very complicated for the learner, and it's overwhelming. So just being presented with a material overloads their working memory, and they can't really handle all that. What do you do in that situation where there's just too much essential processing required? Well, 3 techniques are segmenting, breaking the material down into parts, pre-training, kind of explaining some of the basic concepts before you try to put everything together, and modality, which involves using speech, spoken text rather than printed text. So first let me look at segmenting. So here's, again, a lesson on lightning formation, which obviously we've used a lot. And in this lesson, you are watching a narrated animation. It lasts about 2.5 minutes. In a continuous version, you just watch the whole thing. But in a segmented version, there's a little continue button, in this case in the lower right-hand corner, and you click on that. After about 8, 9, 10 seconds, it stops, and you can click to go on. So it's basically presenting one major event at a time. So cool, moist air moves over a warmer surface and becomes heated. First you hear that, you see the animation. Once you have digested that, you can press continue and go on. So the idea in a segmented presentation is just taking a longer presentation and breaking it into kind of bite-sized parts that are under learner control. And the reason we chose how to do this is that if you let learners decide when to start and stop, they make bad choices. because they don't maybe have the metacognitive skills sometimes to know when would be a good place to stop. So that's why we don't use a scroll bar or something like that. We're stopping it at the major boundaries for them, and then they can press the continue, because we're working mainly with novices here. In 10 out of 10 experimental tests, people learn better from a narrated animation when it's presented in learner-paced segments than as a continuous unit with an effect size close to 0.8, which is considered a large effect size. And you can see this is from a number of different studies with different kinds of content. Okay. I really would love to have questions, but I'm told I should try and hold those for our discussion afterwards in the boardroom. But if anyone has any burning questions, please feel free to raise your hand or just let me know. The next technique I want to look at is pre-training. So in pre-training, the idea is that there are a lot of unfamiliar terms sometimes. So for each key term, it's important that learners know what that word is, be able to pronounce it, be able to define it, kind of know the characteristics of that term, so that when they hear it in a narration, they will be more familiar with that word. So this is from a lesson on braking system. We found people don't know what a lot of the parts really are, like what is a piston in a master cylinder or something like that. So as pre-training, we give people a little map of the braking system. You can click on any part, like in this case, in the second slide, you're clicking on the piston in the master cylinder. When you do that, it is spotlighted, so you see where that is, and it says that this is the piston in the master cylinder. It can move forward or back. So it just tells you where it is, and what it can do. Once people have learned about each part, then we present them with a narrated animation about the entire braking system and how it works. That greatly enhances their understanding of the braking system and allows them to answer transfer questions. So people learn more deeply from a narrated animation when they have training in the names and characteristics of the main concepts. In 13 out of 16 experimental tests, we're getting close to a large effect size, in this case, a median of 0.75. And these are the studies that I'm getting that from. So we have these two techniques of breaking things down, a complicated lesson down into its parts, or providing pre-training. These are ways of managing essential processing. One other technique is what I call the Modality Principle. And this involves presenting the words as narration rather than on-screen text. You might think, why should it make any difference? I mean, words are words. You're presenting the same graphics and the same words, so why should it matter whether they're spoken or printed? But the idea is when they're printed, like on the right side, where you have a caption underneath the animation, you can create a split attention problem, because visual attention, with visual attention, you can only focus on one part of the screen at a time. So if you're looking up at the cloud, you can't be reading the text. If you're reading the text, you can't be looking up at the cloud. So you're probably missing something if it's a fast-paced lesson that has a lot of information in it. Having words as a caption while an animation is going on can cause you to miss part of it. But we can offload those words onto the verbal channel, and that way you can use your eyes for watching the animation and your ears for processing the words. That effectively gives you more processing capacity, because you're making better use of the two channels that we have available. Does that make sense? Okay. This is the most studied of all the principles. In 53 out of 61 experimental tests, it's better to have the words be spoken than printed. But there are cases where it is better to have words on the screen. Sometimes it helps, or sometimes it doesn't make any difference. If the lesson is slow-paced or under learner control, it doesn't really matter. If there are a lot of technical terms, or if the words are in your second language, it might be better to have them printed on the screen. And if the material's pretty complicated and you might have to refer back to it, it's better to have it printed on the screen. So those are all what I would call boundary conditions, and they all make sense in terms of cognitive theory. And the whole point here is that these principles aren't something written down that you have to follow precisely. You have to kind of think about them in terms of how we're processing the information. So you can see here that there have been a lot of studies. Kind of goes on. The early ones pretty much all got evidence from Modality Principle. Then the more recent ones, people were trying to pinpoint the boundary conditions, so we start to get some negative effect sizes here where you can show situations where it doesn't really help. But we can talk about that later also. So 3 evidence-based techniques for managing essential processing are to break the lesson down into parts, provide pre-training, or to use spoken words rather than printed words. So far we've looked at how to eliminate or reduce kind of the extraneous processing that is just wasting cognitive resources, how to deal with a situation where we have a complicated lesson and we have to manage the processing of that. Now let's look at a situation where the learner has the capacity available and the lesson is not overloading, but they still don't really process it very deeply. So this is really the issue of motivation. How do you motivate people to actually want to put out the effort to make sense out of what you're presenting? 2 principles I want to look at here are what I call personalization and voice. And the personalization principle, so I'm kind of a little nervous because this kind of gets me into the world of social psychology, and I'm more of a cognitive psychologist, but sometimes you have to realize, and the instructional process is a social process. We're communicating, and communication involves an interaction between people. So this comes from a lesson on the human respiratory system. The top part is the script for the non-personalized version. It says, during inhaling, the diaphragm moves down, creating more space for the lungs. Air enters through the nose and mouth, moves down through the throat and bronchial tubes to tiny air sacs in the lungs. We took this mainly from 9 textbooks approved for use in California public schools that described how the lungs work. Of those, 2 had such gross factual mistakes in it, they had it just totally wrong. It's kind of interesting, kind of explains a lot about how California students do on some of those standardized tests, but I won't go there right now. The personalized version, all we did was to use first and second person construction rather than formal construction. So instead of saying the, we say your. During inhaling, your diaphragm moves down, creating more space for your lungs. Air enters through your nose or mouth, moves down through your throat. So it's a very subtle change. The thes become yours. But the idea is we're personalizing it because we're trying to create a kind of self-reference here by using you and your. So by personalization, I mean using conversational style, or sometimes when we have an online tutor, using polite style. So that would involve something like, instead of saying, press the enter key, the tutor might say, why don't we press the enter key? That's a more polite way to say it, which you might think is trivial and wouldn't cause any effect. But you can see here in 14 out of 17 experimental tests, using conversational style or polite style results in better transfer test performance than just using formal style, with a median effect size close to 0.8, which is a large effect. So in a lot of different studies using different kinds of materials, including games and simulations, we're getting a pretty strong personalization effect. You can overdo it, though. We've done studies where we make it too heavy-handed and then it doesn't work. So it's kind of a subtle thing. The next version I want to look at is voice. Here the idea is we could have, if we have a narrator, we could have a friendly human voice or a machine synthesized voice. I know computer technology has gotten so good that the computer voices are pretty darn good these days, but you still can generally tell it's not a human voice. So the idea here is we're looking at situations where you could tell that it's not really a human voice. In 5 out of 6 tests that have been done, people learn better when the narration is spoken in a friendly human voice than in a machine voice. And these are some of the studies that have looked at that. And the idea is that you're trying to create some kind of social partnership in the lesson. When you feel like you're in a conversation with someone, you try harder to understand what they're saying. So when you are willing to accept the computer as a social partner, you try harder. Even though you know it's a machine and that's really not a real person, it's just a voice coming through the speaker, you try harder when it's a human voice than when it's a machine-like voice, at least in our studies. Let me look just at, so those are 2 principles for trying to foster generative processing, trying to get people to process more deeply. And this is kind of the collection of all the 10 principles. Coherent signaling, redundancy, and spatial contiguity and temporal contiguity for reducing extraneous processing, segmenting, pre-training, and modality for managing essential processing, and personalization and voice for fostering generative processing. Let me look at a few principles that are emerging. This is one called emotional design that has a long history in our field. Going back to that lesson on how a virus causes a cold, we have the version on the left, which is just using black and white line drawings, which is what we did. Or we can use color with facial expressions. In this case, the virus is in blue has a kind of mean facial expression, whereas the host cell first looks surprised and then starts to look sick after it gets infected there. What we find here is that people learn better actually with the emotional design version, the one on the right. Even though you might think that's a seductive detail, the reason it's not a seductive detail is that it's drawing your attention to the relevant part of the lesson. We want you to understand the relationship between the virus and the host cell. So in this case, adding facial expression to the characters helps. Another technique that seems to help is when we have kind of an online agent, in this case an animated pedagogical agent. Having that agent gesture results in better learning than when the agent just stands still. So in this case, you can see our agent, if he just stands like that and talks but doesn't move, that actually depresses performance on a lesson. This one is explaining how solar cells work. But if he gestures, uses human-like gesture and facial expression, then that helps learning. So we're calling that an embodiment principle, that the instructor, or in this case the on-screen agent, people learn better if he's embodied rather than has low embodiment. And a kind of an extension of this, let's see, I want to make sure I'm not going over time. An extension of this is looking at instructional video. So this is another example of what I think is emerging as an embodiment principle. We could have someone either explain give an explanation with the illustrations already on the board, or draw as she's explaining them. Can you see that well enough to see what those drawings are? Okay. Anybody know what this is about? It's the Doppler effect. Okay, trying to explain the Doppler effect. So here in the version on the left, Celeste is saying exactly the same thing as the version on the right, and she has exactly the same illustrations on the board. It's just on the right, she's drawing them as she talks. People do much better with the version on the right, watching you draw them as you're talking about them. So in this talk, I should not use PowerPoints. I should be drawing out all these slides for you. But it didn't seem feasible, otherwise I would have done that. But It really vindicates all of us old folks who like talk and chalk rather than PowerPoint lectures, because this is kind of showing the talk and chalk results in better transfer test performance. I try to explain this to my students at the beginning of my courses. They don't buy it. And another example of this is just, in this case, watching a video lecture. This is on an iPad. You're just, on the left, you're hearing a narration about the graphics. On the right, you're hearing the same narration as it's being drawn. All you're seeing is the hand drawing it. The one on the right results in much better learning than the one on the left. So again, we're getting kind of a learning by watching someone draw as they're talking seems to help learning, which again we're calling an embodiment principle. There's something about feeling like you're participating in the creation of those illustrations when you're seeing them being drawn. And lastly, this is one where you're watching an assembly task. This is an electrical circuit. If you watch it from first person, where it's like your hands are putting it in, people do better than if you're watching from a third person, where the camera is facing the person. If you look at YouTube, almost all of the videos are from third person. So they all need to be changed to first person to make me happy. So those are all the principles. So my bottom line is, I think we are really on the track of theory-grounded, evidence-based, outcome-focused principles for how to design multimedia e-learning. Most of our studies are short-term lab studies, but there have been some that have been done actually in classrooms. I won't go through those, but they gave us good results. And if you're interested in more information, I suggest these books. I really apologize that they're all by me, but like I say, I want you to have the best. So, so thank you very much for your attention.